The world watched, silent, as the Renault R16 exploded in a fireball on the Rue des Fossés Saint-Bernard. The life of Mohamed Boudia ending in a violent flash of steel and flame. It was June 28th, 1973, 11 in the morning in Paris, and the morning sun glinted off the shattered remains of the car. Police sirens wailed in the distance, a mournful chorus that would soon be joined by the rasp of investigators sifting through the carnage. Boudia, the head of European operations for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, was dead. But the hunt, the real hunt, was just beginning. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of burnt rubber. The cobblestone street, usually bustling with the sounds of Parisian life, was now a tableau of destruction. A uniformed gendarme, his face grim, meticulously photographed the scene, his flashbulb popping like a staccato heartbeat against the backdrop of the city. Metal shards, twisted and grotesque, lay scattered like fallen leaves, each one a potential piece of the puzzle. The early assessment was clumsy bomb, a device that detonated prematurely. But as the technicians delved deeper, the truth emerged, a chilling testament to precision and planning. The bomb, a pressure-activated device, had been strategically placed beneath the driver's seat, a design born of experience and ruthlessness. The Mossad had struck. Boudia, despite his bravado, understood the risks. He was a phantom, a ghost in the machine of European terrorism. He changed residences constantly, donned elaborate disguises, at one point emerging from an apartment building in the guise of an elderly woman, hoping to shake off any tales. He was careful, almost fanatical, except for one fatal flaw. He drove the same car, a humble Renault R16, with its unassuming Parisian license plate, a siren song to those who pursued him. It was a capture point, a weakness that led directly to his demise. The news of Boudia's assassination rippled through the shadowy networks of international terrorism. 5 months later, in Beirut, a young Venezuelan received a direct order. The mission was clear: avenge the commander. The target was Joseph Sif, a British businessman, vice president of the Zionist Federation and a director of Marks & Spencer. The die was cast. The cycle of violence would continue. The world had just taken its first step into a decades-long game. The weight of the impending operation settled heavy on his shoulders, a mixture of fear and determination that gnawed at his gut. The young man, who would soon become infamous, found himself alone with his thoughts, the weight of the mission pressing down on him. The order to kill was a sharp, clear command, no hesitation, no delay. The images of Boudia, his mentor, his comrade, flashed in his mind. The man was a mentor, teacher, and an inspiration. He owed it to his memory, to his cause. The plan, meticulously crafted and rehearsed, unfolded in his mind's eye. Every detail, from the make and model of the gun to the escape route, was etched into his memory. The blood of the first, a necessary sacrifice to ignite a new wave of attacks, would be on the killer's hands. The crisp London night air would soon be filled with the echoes of gunfire. The roar of the hijacked Air France jet engine was a thunderclap that briefly drowned out the screaming. Within the cabin, Carlos, the man the world now knew as the Jackal, straightened his posture, his eyes alight with a dangerous satisfaction. The culmination of the chaos, a symbol of the free world's vulnerability, all of it playing out exactly as planned. The Mossad, deep in Tel Aviv, wasn't focused on the chaos, but on what was next. The question was no longer simply, where is Carlos? It had evolved into, how do we dismantle the geopolitical bunker protecting him? The initial burst of the operation, the attempt on Joseph Sif's life, the attack at Orly, the raid on the OPEC headquarters. Each act, each headline, had provided the Mossad with critical breadcrumbs. They had painstakingly mapped out his network, tracing the flow of money, identifying the safe houses, cataloging the associates, the girlfriends, the fleeting alliances. Yet, like a phantom, he slipped through their fingers, always one step ahead, shielded by a web of geopolitical protection that seemed impenetrable. Carlos was no longer an individual target. He had become a symbol of a shadowy coalition. The agents, men and women of relentless dedication, felt the weight of the endless chase. The frustration was a constant companion, a dull ache beneath the surface of their professionalism. They were the hunters, but the prey seemed to control the terrain, slipping into the shadows of hostile nations, protected by the very governments that should have been cooperating with them. Every dead end, every thwarted attempt, every escape by Carlos fueled the resolve of the analysts back in Tel Aviv. They were driven by a quiet, fierce anger, the desire to avenge the fallen, to protect their own, to send a message to those who harbored such men. The intelligence poured in, a torrent of intercepted communications, surveillance reports, and whispered rumors from the back alleys of the world. It was a digital labyrinth that needed to be decoded and then exploited. The Mossad strategy had to evolve. Direct action was often impossible. Instead, they focused on dismantling the infrastructure that sustained him. They targeted the finances, the logistics, the support network. Every forged passport intercepted, every arms shipment disrupted, every bank account seized was a blow against the bunker. They worked in the shadows, coordinating with other intelligence agencies, sharing information, building a global alliance. The game became about patience, about waiting for the cracks to appear in the facade, the betrayals to surface. They knew that Carlos's reliance on various regimes was his weakness, his Achilles heel. Those regimes were, after all, motivated by self-interest, and the winds of geopolitics could always change. The hunt shifted from individual to network. Agents in Vienna meticulously documented the transactions of shadowy middlemen. Operatives in Beirut worked to infiltrate the Palestinian groups that provided Carlos with training and cover. The Mossad became a master of indirect warfare, seeking to destabilize Carlos's position by undermining the foundations on which he stood. They knew that the capture of Carlos was only the final act of a long play. The true victory would be in dismantling the ideology and the network that allowed someone like him to thrive, to menace the free world, and to be a symbol of defiance. The scent of stale coffee and cheap cigarettes hung thick in the air of the Baghdad safe house as Carlos, now a legend in his own mind, finalized the details of his most audacious agreement yet, a pact with Saddam Hussein. The air crackled with a low hum of anticipation. He adjusted the crisp collar of his silk shirt, the fabric a stark contrast to the gritty surroundings, and ran a hand through his impeccably styled hair. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a coronation of sorts, a formalization of his status as a free agent in the global theater of terror. The room, sparsely furnished with a worn table and a few rickety chairs, offered little in the way of comfort, but Carlos didn't need luxury. He thrived in the shadows, reveling in the clandestine nature of his work. His gaze swept across the faces of the Iraqi officials, men who until recently had been strangers, but who now held the keys to his future. They were a motley crew, a corpulent general with a permanent scowl, a nervous bureaucrat clutching a stack of papers, and a steely-eyed intelligence officer whose gaze never wavered. They represented power, security, and access, the three pillars upon which Carlos intended to build his new empire. He remembered the conversation just a week before. Saddam himself, in the opulent surroundings of a palace, had laid out the terms, speaking of mutual benefit, a shared enemy, and the potential for a long and fruitful partnership. Carlos had listened intently, his expression impassive, but within, he felt a surge of exhilaration. Finally, he would have the resources, the backing, and the operational freedom he had always craved. His exploits, his name, the terror he instilled would be instrumental in the mission. The days of scrabbling for funding, of relying on the goodwill of unreliable patrons, were over. He was trading up, much like a businessman negotiating a lucrative deal. Now, he'd be playing the game on his terms. As the Iraqi officer began to speak, outlining the specifics of the arrangement, safe houses, forged documents, logistical support, Carlos allowed himself a subtle smile. He had effectively become a mercenary, a hired gun with a global reach, but this wasn't just about money or power. It was about the fight. The fight against the West, against Israel, against anyone who stood in the way of his twisted vision of justice. The officer spoke of strategic targets, Western embassies, oil installations, and airfields. The possibilities seemed endless. Carlos felt the familiar thrill of the hunt course through his veins, the same excitement that had fueled him since his early days of training in the camps of the PFLP. He knew he'd need a new team. Experienced, loyal operatives who would follow his every command. He envisioned the coming years, A whirlwind of operations across Europe and beyond, each one meticulously planned, ruthlessly executed. The Mossad, he knew, would be watching, their agents crawling through the shadows, but he was no longer a lone wolf. He was now a predator with an entire pack at his back. He had a powerful patron, access to unlimited funds, and a growing network of dedicated followers. He was ready to make his mark on the world, to leave behind a legacy of fear and defiance. As the officer finished his presentation and the meeting adjourned, Carlos rose to his feet. The stale air of the safe house seemed to clear. This was the dawn of a new era. The humid Baghdad air hung thick with the stench of oil and the promise of impending violence as a man named Itzhak, codenamed the Watchmaker, adjusted the dial on his wristwatch, his gaze sweeping across the crowded Al-Rashid Street. Carlos had just sealed a pact with Saddam Hussein. This wasn't merely a tactical shift. This was the formation of a geopolitical bunker, a fortress of influence designed to keep Carlos untouchable, even in the crosshairs of an operation. Itzhak's stomach churned with a familiar cocktail of apprehension and grim resolve. He adjusted his fedora, a useless gesture in the stifling heat, and let his eyes focus on the bustle of the open-air market, the vendors hawking dates and spices, the children laughing as they chased pigeons. He felt a sting of hatred for all those innocents. The world was being made ugly by monsters. The Mossad had been chasing Carlos for years, a phantom that flitted between borders, leaving a trail of blood and destruction in its wake. They'd learned quickly that direct action was often a fool's errand. Every attempt, a calculated risk, a bloody footnote. Now, the task demanded a different approach. The key wasn't just Carlos, it was the fortress around him, the political patronage, the covert funding, and the iron-fisted support of the Ba'athist regime. That was their true target. Itzhak understood the shift in strategy. It was a cold, calculating chess game. Carlos was a dangerous, volatile piece, but the Mossad could not simply move the piece off the board. He had to weaken the supporting structure first. Every forged passport, every untraceable bank account, every sympathetic government that offered him safe haven. All of these elements were intertwined, forming a complex tapestry of protection. Itzhak had to unravel the threads, slowly, painstakingly, until the structure began to crumble. He felt the weight of the task settling on his shoulders. He was good at this, he knew. He was one of the best. But he also understood that this particular game was a marathon. He closed his eyes, momentarily shutting out the chaos around him. He pictured the dossier on Carlos, the endless photographs, the intercepted communications, the whispers of informants in the shadows. He saw the network expanding, reaching out across the globe. He imagined all of them at his disposal. He visualized the network, stretching from Damascus to Budapest, from Tripoli to East Berlin. Each node, a potential weakness. Each connection, a thread to be pulled. The hunt was no longer just about assassinating a man. It was about dismantling a web of deceit, eroding the foundations of his protection. He knew that the task would demand patience, meticulous planning, and a willingness to operate in the gray areas of international law. He had to be like the Watchmaker, dismantling the delicate mechanism of Carlos's world, piece by piece, until the entire operation ground to a halt. Itzhak's gaze settled on a group of children playing marbles in the dust. They were completely oblivious to the danger, the intrigue, the world-altering machinations taking place around them. He wondered what they would think of Carlos if they could ever understand the darkness that lurked in the shadows. He would not allow their innocence to be shattered. He had a duty to make the world safe for them and for the future. He would fight this fight on behalf of the children and all the innocents of the world. The acrid tang of explosives still clung to the air in a Budapest safe house when the Mossad surveillance team, codenamed the Architects, finally zeroed in on the network. It wasn't a dramatic takedown, no gun battles or daring escapes. Instead, it was a slow, methodical unraveling of Carlos's web of support. A spider's silk thread pulled taut until it snapped, revealing the hidden arachnid. The team, a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh recruits, understood that Carlos himself, a phantom flitting between borders, was untouchable for now. The real key lay in the mundane, the overlooked, the infrastructure that allowed him to operate. The Architects began with Magdalena Kopp, Carlos's fiercely loyal partner, and a key figure in his operations. They knew her movements, her routines, the mundane details of her life that provided a rhythm to track. Kopp was a German national, a veteran of the Red Army faction, and her skills extended far beyond romance. She was a facilitator, a logistician, and a crucial link in the chain. The team spent months compiling a profile: the cafes she frequented, the shops she patronized, the coded messages she exchanged. The aim wasn't to eliminate her, but to understand the lines she pulled, the connections she maintained. Budapest was chosen for a reason. The city, once firmly behind the Iron Curtain, still offered a degree of plausible deniability, a place where secrets could fester in the shadows. The Mossad agents moved in the city with a chilling calm, a precision that masked their deep-seated anxiety. Their apartments were austere, furnished with only the essentials. Their days were a blur of observation, long hours spent in cars parked on grimy streets, hunched over monitors, listening to whispered conversations in cramped listening posts. The air in their makeshift office, a rented flat in a nondescript building, was thick with cigarette smoke and the low hum of electronics. Each agent had a specific role, a part of the whole, from the language specialists who deciphered intercepted communications to the technical experts who maintained the sophisticated surveillance equipment. The focus shifted to the safe houses, the hidden havens where Carlos and his cohorts could rest, plan, and prepare. These were the veins and arteries of the operation, providing sanctuary, staging areas, and communication hubs. The architects used a combination of old-fashioned detective work and cutting-edge technology. They employed informants, double agents within Carlos's network, who provided invaluable insights. These individuals risked their lives every day, their faces etched with the fear that they tried to hide. They lived in constant fear of discovery, of the brutal retribution Carlos was known to inflict. The team also utilized satellite imagery, meticulously mapping out the city, identifying potential locations, and cross-referencing this data with intelligence reports. The team uncovered a network of apartments, flats, and villas, each one carefully chosen for its anonymity and accessibility. 1. A seemingly ordinary apartment in a quiet residential district was revealed to be a communication center equipped with sophisticated radio equipment. Another, a seemingly abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, served as a storage facility for weapons and explosives. The atmosphere in the team's quarters crackled with anticipation as they mapped the web of locations and people. Each piece of information was meticulously logged and cross-referenced, building a comprehensive picture of Carlos's support network. It was slow, painstaking work, but the architects knew they were on the verge of a breakthrough. They knew that with each thread they pulled, they were one step closer to dismantling the shadow empire that protected the most wanted man in the world. The phone rang in the Tel Aviv safe house, the shrill sound cutting through the quiet hum of the surveillance equipment. It was a call from their contact in the Hungarian Interior Ministry, a man known only as the Baker. He spoke in hurried, broken Hebrew, his voice laced with panic. "They're moving money, large amounts. Budapest! Immediately!" The information, however fragmented, was enough. A coded message from a courier traveling through the city. The Mossad's Vienna station had been monitoring the financial transactions of Carlos's network for months. A slow, painstaking process. Their strategy, born of necessity and frustration, was one of strategic patience. They couldn't touch Carlos directly, not while he enjoyed the protection of Syria, Iraq, and the shifting alliances of other hostile nations. Their only recourse was to choke the life out of his operations, to dismantle his financial infrastructure, the sinews that kept him connected to his sponsors and provided him the means to carry out his attacks. The Budapest operation was a dance of shadows and whispers. Agents embedded in seemingly innocuous positions, a travel agency, a currency exchange, a small printing shop, moved in tandem. They watched the arrival of a nondescript briefcase, its contents suspected to be bearer bonds and gold, a fortune in illicit funds. The courier, a nervous Lebanese man with a penchant for expensive suits, was shadowed by two operatives, their faces impassive, their movements invisible to the casual observer. The chase led them through crowded markets, past ornate buildings, into a labyrinth of narrow, winding streets. The agents' hearts pounded, not with the thrill of the hunt, but with the pressure to execute flawlessly. A single mistake could expose the operation, trigger an alarm, and send the money and the courier disappearing into the abyss. They trailed the courier to a nondescript apartment building. A signal was relayed back to Tel Aviv and the unit in Vienna. "Confirm," said the director. "We are going live." They had found Carlos's key man for money laundering, and now it was time to move. In the small building, they had planned to make a move, to seize the money, to cripple Carlos's financial support. The operatives moved with practiced efficiency, their training ingrained. They moved past the local police, who were ready to be on the other side of the law. The agents felt the electric thrill of anticipation. As they slipped the door lock, a wave of adrenaline surging through their veins. The agent entered the apartment. Inside, the courier was counting the money. The agents yelled for them to get down, but they did not obey. The courier reached for his pocket. It all happened in a blur of motion. The agents were quicker, their movements precise. The funds were seized. The courier was apprehended. The apartment was stripped of anything that could be traced back to Carlos's network. Back in Tel Aviv, the director studied the documents recovered in Budapest, the names of shell companies, bank accounts, and the meticulously planned movements of the funds. They were squeezing the life out of Carlos's operations, a slow but sure dismantling of his global infrastructure. The agents knew that this was the most effective approach. They were removing the building blocks of his actions, forcing him into choices with little room for comfort. He knew that the ultimate prize was the man himself. But until the political climate shifted, until the opportunity presented itself, patience was their most potent weapon. The earth trembled as the bomb detonated outside the Saint-Charles train station in Marseille, shattering glass and ripping through metal. The scream of the injured blended with the rising sirens, a symphony of chaos that echoed Carlos's wrath. He had tasted blood, the sweet, metallic tang of vengeance, and the hunt had never been so close. The arrest of Magdalena Kopp, his lover, and a key operative had been the catalyst. Held in a Parisian cell, she became a bargaining chip, a pawn in a game of high-stakes terrorism. Carlos responded with a campaign of terror, a brutal reminder of his reach and influence. The Mossad, its agents scattered across Europe, watched with a grim understanding. Carlos was escalating. He was playing a game of escalating violence, and the stakes were rising with each explosion. The first strike hit Marseille, a city of sun-drenched facades and bustling docks, now stained crimson. The Saint-Charles station became a charnel house, the air thick with the smell of cordite and the cries of the wounded. The French government, reeling from the attack, doubled down on its efforts. The DST, the French counterintelligence agency, intensified its pursuit, coordinating with the Mossad, sharing intelligence, and piecing together fragments of the puzzle. The names and faces of the dead flashed across the television screens, their stories silenced in an instant of indiscriminate fury. From the safety of his hideout, Carlos reveled in the pandemonium. He imagined the fear, the panic, the scrambling of authorities to contain the damage. He wasn't merely striking targets. He was broadcasting a message of power and defiance. He was a force of nature, a shadow flitting between nations, untouchable and relentless. The fear was a symphony he composed, orchestrated with timers, explosives, and the blood of innocence. The world was his stage, and the headlines were his accolades. The Mossad agents, meanwhile, moved with a cold precision. They weren't seeking revenge. They were seeking control. Their network of informants, their intercepted communications, and their meticulous surveillance provided a constant stream of information. They saw through Carlos's bravado, recognized the desperation beneath the veneer of invincibility. They understood his vulnerabilities, his dependencies. The focus was not just on stopping the attacks, but on dismantling the infrastructure that made them possible. They knew that for every act of violence, there was an entire operation and network they would need to take down. The second strike targeted the Toulouse-Paris train, a symbol of national pride and connectivity. The explosion tore through a carriage, leaving behind a scene of carnage and despair. The victims became a statistic, their names added to the growing list of Carlos's victims. Each act of violence further isolated him from any support base. The world was coming to realize he was a liability, a loose cannon. The Mossad saw this. They could almost feel him unraveling, not from fear, but from the pressure of his own making. The city of Paris was now in a state of siege. The police presence was heavy, security tightened. The Mossad watched, waiting, knowing that the hunter, in his desperation, would eventually make a mistake. They saw the pattern, the increasing volatility, the inevitable error that would reveal his weakness. They knew that in his quest to become a legend, Carlos would ultimately betray himself. The hunt was far from over. It was about to enter a new and even more deadly phase. The image of Carlos, a phantom of revolutionary zeal and calculated brutality, stared back from every newspaper and television screen, his face a menacing mask. The arrest of Magdalena Kopp, his longtime companion, ignited a firestorm, and suddenly the world watched, breathless, as the hunt for Carlos escalated. Now a wanted man by every major intelligence agency in the free world. A dark cloud hung over Europe, thick with the acrid scent of explosives and the chilling echoes of gunfire. The press, hungry for every scrap of information, had dubbed him the Jackal, a label that both terrified and intrigued the public. The Mossad, its operatives scattered across the continent, felt the pressure mount. Every bombing, every act of violence fueled the fire. Each attack on a synagogue, each assassination of a perceived enemy, served as a stark reminder of the mission's importance. The team working on Carlos understood that they were not merely pursuing an individual, but a symbol of defiance, a challenge to their very existence. This was more than a manhunt. It was a war, waged in the shadows, with the fate of innocent lives hanging in the balance. In the aftermath of the bombings, the Mossad intensified its surveillance. Every contact, every suspected safe house was scrutinized. Agents worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and a grim determination. The intricate web of Carlos's associates, the networks that sustained him, became their sole focus. Information flowed in a torrent, intercepted communications, whispered rumors, and coded messages. The analysis cell in Tel Aviv worked tirelessly, piecing together the jigsaw puzzle of his life. The attacks grew bolder, more brazen. The bombing of the St. Charles train station in Marseille, a scene of horrific carnage, left the public reeling. The Mossad agents on the ground felt the despair, the outrage. Each victim was a chilling reminder of the enemy they hunted and the price of failure. The French government, under immense pressure, intensified its own pursuit, and the cooperation between the agencies grew more seamless, driven by desperation and a shared desire for justice. The Mossad understood that Carlos was a master of disguise, a chameleon who could vanish in a crowd. They knew he moved through a maze of false identities, utilizing forged passports and leveraging his ability to slip between countries with little regard for borders. But they also knew his weaknesses: the need for money, the reliance on certain trusted confidants, and the ever-present hunger for attention. They focused on these vulnerabilities, hoping to exploit them, to expose the man behind the myth. The hunt was not just about catching Carlos, it was about dismantling his organization, crippling his ability to inflict further damage. The Mossad's strategy was multifaceted. Information was passed to allies. Finances were traced. They knew the world was watching and that their reputation depended on finding the phantom. The shadow war continued, a desperate, dangerous dance, with the world's most wanted man always a step ahead. The humid Damascus air hung heavy, thick with the scent of roasting lamb and jasmine, as Carlos, now a ghost in the shadows, watched the city slowly settle into the languid pace of late afternoon. He hadn't seen a Western face in months, a conscious choice to vanish completely from the radar of those who hunted him. He knew the Mossad was still out there, its tendrils reaching, always reaching. But for now he was safe, cocooned within the steel embrace of Syrian protection. The irony was bitter. He, the man who had reveled in chaos, the architect of explosions and mayhem, was now a guest in a gilded cage. He'd arrived in Damascus in 1985, a deal struck with Hafiz al-Assad, the iron-fisted ruler of Syria. In exchange for ceasing attacks on Western targets, he'd been granted sanctuary. The promise of security, of a life free from constant flight and the relentless fear of capture, had been too tempting to resist. He was weary of the chase, the adrenaline-fueled existence that had defined him for so long. Now, he needed rest, time to heal the wounds, both physical and psychological, that the years of violence had inflicted. He leased a spacious apartment in a quiet residential neighborhood, a stark contrast to the safe houses and fleeting hotels of his past. He had Magdalena, a constant reminder of the life he was beginning to forge, and a growing network of loyal bodyguards, all hand-picked and fiercely dedicated. The city itself was a tapestry of ancient history and modern intrigue. The souks, vibrant and chaotic, offered a sensory overload of sights, sounds, and smells. The scent of spices mixed with the call to prayer, the chatter of merchants vying for his attention, and the distant rumble of traffic. He felt a strange sense of belonging, a comfort in the anonymity the city offered. But it was also a place of secrets, a city where whispers carried the weight of power, where alliances were forged and broken in the blink of an eye. He knew that beneath the veneer of normalcy, the regime was playing a dangerous game, one that he was now a pawn in. He often found himself on the balcony of his apartment, overlooking the sprawling cityscape. The distant lights of the city twinkled like fallen stars, while the air vibrated with the persistent thrum of unseen activity. He would light a cigarette, the ember glowing like a defiant spark in the darkness, and let his thoughts drift. Sometimes he'd replay the events of his life, the decisions, the victories, the losses. He'd wonder if he'd made the right choices, if the years of bloodshed had been worth it. The answer, he knew, was elusive, buried deep within the labyrinth of his own mind. He knew this new calm was temporary, just as the previous lives had been. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, he met with one of Assad's intelligence chiefs. The man was all icy charm and veiled threats, the perfect embodiment of the regime's duality. He laid out the rules of the game with chilling precision. Stay out of trouble, cause no ripples, and be grateful for the protection. Carlos, in turn, offered his compliance, a promise of silence and a willingness to fade into the background. For now, he was content to abide by the agreement. He had seen the fate of those who defied Assad, the price of disobedience. The cage was comfortable, luxurious even, but it was still a cage, and the key, he knew, was in the hands of his captors. He would have to patiently await his moment, the opportune time for a new chapter. The hunting might be over for the time being, but the animal was far from tamed. The Berlin Wall crumbled, and with it, the edifice that had sheltered Carlos crumbled too, leaving him exposed in the harsh light of a changing world. It was a November evening in 1989, a chill wind whistling through the Brandenburg Gate, as jubilant Berliners began hacking at the symbol of Cold War division. Carlos, sheltered in Damascus, felt the tremors of this seismic shift. The ideological underpinnings of his support network, the unwavering commitment of the Eastern Bloc to anti-imperialism, the promise of a global communist revolution, were rapidly dissolving. The fall of the wall was more than a symbolic event. It was a death knell for his operational infrastructure. The reliable East German safe houses, the forged passports, the covert financial transfers funneled through Budapest. All of it was now jeopardized. The Stasi, once a powerful ally, was in disarray, its agents facing the prospect of investigation and arrest. Their willingness to turn a blind eye to Carlos's activities, their ability to provide him with false identities and safe passage, was gone. The carefully constructed network of support, the geopolitical bunker that had shielded him for so long, was starting to erode from within. He paced the confines of his comfortable, yet increasingly constricting apartment in Damascus, the scent of jasmine from the courtyard gardens doing little to soothe his mounting anxiety. He'd always prided himself on his adaptability, his ability to thrive in chaos. But this was different. This was a fundamental reshaping of the world order, and the very ground beneath his feet was shifting. The old certainties, the predictable alliances, were gone. He found himself increasingly isolated, reliant on the unpredictable goodwill of regimes whose priorities were shifting. The flow of funds from Libya and Syria, once a torrent, began to dwindle as their leaders cautiously eyed the West, seeking to shed their image as pariah states. The Mossad, keenly aware of these tectonic shifts, increased its efforts, knowing Carlos was vulnerable. They intensified their surveillance, using every asset they had to track his movements, identify his contacts, and anticipate his next move. The files on Carlos grew thicker, accumulating more details about his movements. The relentless pressure of the hunt, combined with the instability of his support network, began to take its toll. His paranoia, always a constant companion, intensified. The familiar faces around him, the bodyguards, the intermediaries, were viewed with a growing degree of suspicion. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 further accelerated the dismantling of his protection. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and with it, the security and support system that had shielded him from the reach of Western intelligence agencies. Hungary, a frequent source of his false documents, revoked them. The Eastern Bloc, once a haven, had become a liability, and any chance of a quick escape route to these territories was lost. He was like a trapped animal, prowling restlessly in his cage, aware that the walls were closing in, the bars growing tighter with each passing day. The hunter was patient, and the prey was increasingly desperate. The cracks in the bunker were widening, and the end, although not yet in sight, was undeniably near. The man who had once seemed invincible, the icon of international terror, was now facing the grim reality of a world that had turned against him. His once reliable support was now becoming a treacherous quicksand, pulling him towards an uncertain fate. The sweat on Carlos's brow mirrored the rising humidity in Khartoum, a city baking under the relentless Sudanese sun. He had just finished a tense meeting, the details of which he preferred to keep locked away in the recesses of his mind. The air hung thick, a suffocating blanket woven with the scent of dust and diesel, the cacophony of street vendors hawking their wares, a constant drone in his ears. He knew, even as he sipped his lukewarm tea, that the walls were closing in, a tightening noose of international pressure he could no longer ignore. He felt it in the veiled glances of his Sudanese hosts, in the increasingly curt tone of their pronouncements. His luxurious suite in the Grand Hotel, once a haven of opulence, now felt more like a gilded cage. He'd arrived in Khartoum in 1993, a weary traveler seeking refuge. The world he once knew, the labyrinthine network of support that sustained him for years, was crumbling around him. The fall of the Berlin Wall had been a harbinger of doom, shattering the Iron Curtain that shielded him from Western retribution. The collapse of the Soviet Union had severed his ties to the Eastern Bloc, the false passports and safe houses dissolving like morning mist. The Gulf War had decimated Saddam Hussein's regime, his most steadfast patron. Now, here he was, in the heart of Sudan, a country struggling to maintain its place on the international stage, a nation increasingly reliant on the largesse of the West. He was nothing more than a liability, and he knew it. The city itself was a stark contrast to his past havens. Gone were the vibrant, cosmopolitan streets of Paris and London, the clandestine meetings in dimly lit cafes. Here, the landscape was dominated by sand and sky, a vast expanse that mirrored the emptiness growing within him. The city held a strange mix of the familiar and the alien. He recognized the undercurrents of political intrigue, the whispered conversations, the watchful eyes. But he also felt the weight of isolation, the chilling realization that he was no longer the master of his fate, but a pawn in a larger game. He was a man out of time, a relic of a bygone era. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the sprawling city. He sat on his balcony, the humid air still heavy with the day's heat. He stared out at the dusty streets below, watching the city slowly surrender to the darkness, the sounds of prayers echoing in the gathering twilight. He thought of his past, the victories and the defeats, the lives he'd touched and the lives he'd destroyed. Regret, a bitter and unwelcome companion, began to gnaw at him. He knew he was nearing the end of his road. He could feel it in the air, in the uneasy silences, in the calculated smiles. The hunt was far from over, but the hunter had become the hunted. The sterile antiseptic scent of the clinic in Khartoum was the last thing Carlos would remember before the world dissolved into blackness, his last moments of freedom ending with a swift and brutal efficiency. He'd come to the clinic for a minor testicular procedure, a routine matter in a city where discretion was often a luxury. 2 days after the procedure, Sudanese officials informed him of an urgent need to relocate. A threat, they claimed, a potential assassination attempt. The promise of personal protection, of trusted guards, was the balm they offered. He should have known better, the veteran of countless betrayals. But the allure of safety, of a temporary reprieve from the constant tension, had proven too strong. The night was hot, a humid blanket clinging to his skin as he drifted into a deep, drug-induced sleep. The guards, supposedly assigned to protect him, entered his room in the pre-dawn hours. He felt a sharp prick, the sting barely registering before the world spun and faded, the darkness consuming him. He awoke hours later, disoriented and groggy, the rhythmic drone of a jet engine filling his ears. The world swam back into focus. He was in a plane. the sterile environment of a private jet replacing the dusty, familiar surroundings of his Khartoum apartment. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of the drugs. This was not a rescue. He thought of the years, the relentless chase, the constant threat that had defined his life. He pictured the faces he had known, the comrades, lovers, enemies, all swirling in a dizzying carousel. The past swirled, the present blurred, and the future, a vast unknown. His mind flashed back to the dusty streets of Caracas, the revolutionary fervor that ignited his youth, the university hallways where he first encountered the Palestinians and their struggle, and the training camps where he learned to dismantle a weapon faster than most could assemble one. As he was forced to remember the attacks, the political assassinations, the bombings that had become synonymous with his name, he now imagined the faces of the victims, a gallery of forgotten faces. The innocent lives taken, and the lives altered forever. He could no longer deny the weight of his actions, a crushing burden of guilt that settled upon his chest. He was a shadow, a whisper in the wind, a legend built on fear and destruction. His actions became a tapestry of violence woven with the threads of ideology, ambition, and a twisted sense of justice. The plane began its descent, the lights of Paris twinkling like distant stars. He knew then where he was going. He thought about the iron bars that awaited him, and a final feeling of resignation settled within him. The game was over. The hunt had ended. He was a captured animal. He understood the meticulous planning that had led to this moment, the years of relentless surveillance, the meticulous collection of data, the quiet whispers in the shadows. He saw it all in retrospect, the web of alliances, betrayals, and the intricate dance of intelligence agencies. His capture wasn't an act of chance, but the culmination of a decades-long pursuit, a global chess game played with lives as pieces. The French, he realized, were the victors, but they had needed the Mossad. The plane touched down. The door hissed open, and the bright, sterile light of the waiting room swallowed him. The cycle of violence, for him at least, was finally coming to an end. The needle plunged, and the world dissolved into a black canvas speckled with fleeting stars. The sting in his arm was the last thing Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, known to the world as Carlos, the Jackal, felt before oblivion claimed him. It was a warm Khartoum night, the air thick with the scent of dust and the promise of rain. His dreams, as always, were haunted by the faces of his enemies and the echoes of explosions. Now they were replaced with a dizzying rush, a sensation of falling into an endless abyss. He woke to blinding lights and the metallic tang of fear. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled his nostrils. He tried to move, but his limbs were heavy, his body unresponsive. Panic clawed at his throat. He was no longer in his room, the sanctuary he'd carved out in this Sudanese backwater. He was in a cold, unfamiliar place, the hum of machinery a constant, unsettling drone in his ears. His mind raced, struggling to piece together the fragments of what had happened. The supposed medical procedure, the assurances, the guards who were supposed to protect him. They were gone, replaced by faces he didn't recognize, speaking a language he didn't understand. The faces blurred into a singular image. The French. He remembered the dossiers, the warnings from his contacts. The French, driven by vengeance, would not rest. He tasted the metallic tang of blood in his mouth and felt a throbbing ache in his head, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. The Sudanese had betrayed him. The political winds had shifted, and his usefulness, his value, had vanished. He felt a chilling certainty creep into his heart. He had been sold out. He saw the plane, an anonymous jet on a foreign tarmac. The French agents were all around, their expressions impassive, their eyes cold and calculating. The cage he had built around himself, the intricate network of protection he had carefully cultivated over decades, had crumbled. The walls he had erected to shield himself from the world's wrath were crumbling, and they were coming closer. The weight of his past, the bombings, the assassinations, the countless lives he'd touched and destroyed, pressed down on him, suffocating. The faces of his victims flickered before his eyes, a spectral parade of the dead. He felt an intense, crushing loneliness. He fought against the restraints, a desperate animal trapped in a steel cage. It was a futile gesture, a silent scream in the face of inevitable defeat. He cursed the betrayal, the shifting alliances, the fickle nature of the world. He cursed his arrogance, his hubris, the belief that he was untouchable. All the years of cunning and ruthless efficiency had led to this. A cold clinical room, an abrupt flight, a new prison. He thought of Magdalena, his wife, who had been freed years ago. He wondered what she was doing, if she knew what had happened. He hoped she was safe. He thought of his children, the faces he barely knew. He wanted them to remember him, not as the monster the world painted him to be, but as something more. The plane ascended into the clouds, leaving Khartoum far behind. The French agents remained silent, their eyes fixed on him. Carlos closed his eyes, accepting his fate. The hunt was over. The game was done. The jackal finally was caught. The Sudanese guards, faces grim under the harsh Khartoum sun, led him towards the waiting aircraft, the screams of the previous night, a distant memory. Carlos, once the embodiment of revolutionary defiance, now shuffled forward, his freedom lost to the same geopolitical machinations he had so ruthlessly exploited. His capture wasn't the dramatic, bullet-riddled showdown one might expect, the stuff of cinema and legend. No, it was a silent, orchestrated betrayal, a testament to the patient accumulation of intelligence and the shifting sands of global alliances. The humid African air hung heavy as he was pushed into the belly of the French jet, the scent of jet fuel and sterile metal filling his nostrils. The plane was a cage, a far cry from the opulent hotels and safe houses he had once commanded. Around him, the faces of the French agents were impassive, their eyes holding no hint of triumph, just the cold, professional efficiency of a task completed. His mind raced, a frantic torrent of memories. The exhilaration of the Vienna raid, the adrenaline-fueled chaos of the Houtulier shootout, the hushed whispers of deals made in darkened rooms. He felt a deep sense of betrayal, the sting of being sold out by those he had trusted, by the very regimes that had once welcomed him as a hero. He thought back to the endless string of aliases he had used, the fake passports, the false identities. All of it, a life built on a foundation of lies. A house of cards now collapsing around him. He closed his eyes, his mind replaying the faces of his victims, the innocents caught in the crossfire of his ideological battles. Was this the inevitable consequence of his actions? Was this cold, unforgiving reality finally catching up to him? As the aircraft soared into the sky, leaving the Sudanese desert behind, he saw in his mind's eye the meticulous work of the Mossad. He knew it well, the unwavering surveillance, the endless accumulation of data, the quiet, persistent agents who tracked his every move, always patiently waiting for a crack in the facade. He felt a grudging respect for their persistence, for their dedication to their mission. He remembered their operatives, their methods, the whispers of fear and respect that surrounded them. Their tenacity was matched only by their discretion. The French agents didn't seem to notice his thoughts, their focus fixed on the journey ahead. The destination, a French courtroom where he would face the consequences of his actions. They knew the details of his past, the names of the people he had killed, the attacks he had orchestrated. They held the evidence, the carefully gathered intelligence, the weight of his crimes. He was nothing but a pawn now, the final piece in a complex game. He was no longer a leader, a revolutionary, or a celebrated international terrorist. He was simply Carlos, a prisoner of his own making. The story was over. The hunt had ended. The world, its news cycles, its intelligence agencies, would move on to a new target, a new threat. But his story, the story of Carlos, would live on as a lesson in the dangers of extremism, the enduring power of intelligence, and the inevitable consequences of a life lived on the edge of chaos. The vast machinery of counterterrorism had won, not through brute force, but through relentless patience, an unwavering gaze, and the slow, deliberate grind of justice. As the plane touched down in Paris, he knew his world had shrunk, his freedom extinguished. He was going to spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, surrounded by nothing but the ghosts of his past. The end of an era had arrived,